Chapter 5 Museum. Soon they were ready and went out for an early breakfast to an outdoor cafe. Given the choice of fried fish, fried fruit, fresh baked spice cake, crocado eggs, or fried scrackle stew, Machwa surprised Saruth by choosing the stew. When asked about it, Machwa grinned. "The scrackle that woke me escaped, but its kind pay. Bitter vengeance is delicious." Saruth lifted a brow, bursting into one of his chuckling sprees that ended with a wry smile. "Young Machwa, sometimes you truly remind me why the finest things in life are free. No amount of money or power in the world can provide as much humor or blessing as a single child can." Machwa's ears lay back. "Saruth, do you have to call me a child? I'm not a little kid." Saruth smiled and reached across the table to ruffle Machwa's ears. "Where I'm from, at 30 winters, they still consider me a child, of a sort. My words often fall on unreceptive ears because of my youth. I suppose in some instances I must call you that because that is what you in some ways are, but each day I find you more a man and less a boy, Machwa." Machwa flicked his tail as he crossed his arms and gave the man a practiced glare. He didn't swat. Saruth smiled as he drew his hand back. "You know, the longer I know you, the less effect that look has. Take heart. I'm proud of the person you are, and even more of that which you are becoming." Machwa smirked, the movements of his tail shifting to happier ones. He smiled and stabbed his fork into his bowl, and then drew a bite to his mouth and narrowed his eyes in vengeful pleasure while chewing his food with his mouth open. After finishing breakfast and tipping the person who was both the cook and waiter, they made their way to the National Museum of Regenta. It was a large stone building that looked ancient in design, built like a temple with mirrors and skylights made of rare, precious glass. After paying the small admission to one of the spear-holding guards at the gate, Saruth led Machwa into a world of wonder. Just inside the door was a small room with a high ceiling. On the facing wall was a painted wooden support pillar made to look like a huge tree, with a tunnel into the next room in its center. Several long vines grew upon it, and they would have been nondescript, save that each one offered up large flowers that consisted of a hanging cluster of tiny triangular petals as long as Machwa's palm. The petals rather reminded him of scale armor, only much more exquisite. Each flower was of a single rich color, and though all the vines were the same type and every vine had but a single primary color to its blooms, no two blossoms seemed to have the same hue. Together the vines offered a festival of vibrant colors from deep violet to dark red and everything in the rainbow between. They made a dazzling show from the fake roots of the display inching around the trunk to the heights of the room above, the ceiling festooned with their riotous grandeur. Machwa's mouth hung open as he stared up at the spread of carved flowers that hung in perfect strands from fake branches and clung to the ceiling all the way across it to meet the walls. "Whoa, Saruth! What is it?" There was a smile, and Saruth pointed by the tunnel to the small brass stand holding an aged plaque as he read, "The Regenta vine blooms each spring, and its wonderful scent is the source of the famed sweet wind that can be smelled throughout the countryside as far as neighboring Berumith every year. Its resilience allows for it to be transplanted into clothing made of plant strands and grown for weddings and other celebrations. This plant is very mobile, its roots seeking dirt and cracks and barks of trees to allow it to crawl over them in search of injuries. It is known to uproot itself and flow throughout the landscape, strengthening any other plant it touches. When damage in another plant is found, it moves to fill the wound, forming a symbiotic relationship and nourishing its host while healing it. Because of its benevolent and beautiful nature, its name was chosen as the name for our country. May we ever look to the Regenta vine and remember to aspire to these qualities." The next room was far larger, and in it were paintings on Futh canvas and dyed tapestries in crocado silk, depicting Sage Opton and other people of note, such as explorer Sebastian. Others had images of fierce battles in the past and of Tortangas. The most impressive of them all filled most of a wall and depicted a city in giant trees, wreathed in Regenta vines in full bloom. Machwa pointed to the golden plaque under the center of it and asked Saruth what it said about the picture. Saruth leaned to look at the plaque. "This is a picture of Wazella, capital city of Regenta, and it says, 'May tradition guide us, truth live inside us, and justice chide us, that we may never forget who we are or why our culture thrives. Let none change what we have made, that it may always bring joy to our people." He turned to Machwa. "I suppose it is a creed of a sort. You see, Machwa, there's a saying about Wazella that it is timeless, and that seasons change, but it does not. That is why they do not allow roads built to it or strangers to travel there alone. This protects the city from becoming something it isn't, and preserves their culture for all time." Machwa blinked. "But why? Why not let it get bigger and better like Baruma's city did? I don't know much about my home, but I do know that it's probably the richest, biggest, best city in Nam." Saruth lifted a brow in that way he was known to do. "Better, you say? Are you sure it's better?" Machwa was confident a moment before, but upon that question he found himself without a real reason to prove the superiority of his hometown to others. He shrugged and said in a small voice, "Well, what could be better than Baruma's city?" Saruth smiled and leaned on his staff. "That depends on what one values most. If profit and belongings are what a person lives for, then yes, Baruma's city is better. But if people hunger for tranquility and the abundance of nature, it is a poor choice for an abode for them. I'm sure when you see Wazella you'll find yourself a greater authenticity for this in your heart than my words could express." Machwa didn't want to seem silly, but curiosity compelled him to lift a brow. "Often what?" Saruth sure talked a lot more than anyone he'd ever known, but was sometimes easier to understand than others. Saruth chuckled. "Authenticity. It's from the word authentic and means genuine or true. I'm saying that you'll know what I'm talking about when you see it better than you would listening to me talk about it." Machwa snorted. "Why didn't you just say so?" "Mm-hmm." Saruth narrowed his eyes and gave a strange little grin. "Come now, let's have a look at the next room of trade displays and see what this country makes for others. Their industry is quite impressive, I hear." Off they went into the next room, where they found various goods. One of the most noteworthy was the crocado silk. Saruth pointed to the display that was festooned with silks woven to show these animals and making of their silk. "Crocado silk is soft, lighter than foothcloth, and stronger as well. It is taken from the webs the creatures leave behind in trees after they transform from their worm-like larval state into hopping fish-like adults. Each year, during the season that the cocoons open and the crocados fall into the waters of the swamp, workers go deep into the wetlands to gather much of the silk and bring it back to towns and cities to process and dye it. Because there are very few futh trees in Magenta, this silk is our primary source of material for clothing." Machwa held a small length of the smooth silk cloth attached to the display, feeling it slide from the pads of his fingers as he tugged his hand away. Saruth chuckled. Near that was a display dedicated to a small shrub that grew in patches of dirt in the swamp and had small, blue, nut-like pods growing from it. A cutout of one against a small circle of glass showed a gooey blue paste with 2 seeds in it. Saruth mentioned that chewing on the paste was good for teeth and served to clean them. The next display was on fishing spears and other fishing tools, citing fish as a large portion of the common Magentan diet. Beside it was a display of expertly carved fish in several species. There were other displays, including one on Zarmuth gut goods like waterproof packs, hats, and slickers. It had a preserved Zarmuth that was 15 feet tall, and was so well kept that Machwa's tail flicked about as he stood near it, his active imagination telling him that it could move to get him at any moment. While he was staring at it, Saruth put a hand on his shoulder, which caused him to jump and hiss at the same time. There was a muffled chuckle as Saruth put his other hand over his mouth. Machwa growled, pushing the hand off his shoulder. Saruth just smiled. "Come, Machwa, there's another display over here that would greatly interest you." With a snort, Machwa followed to where there was a wooden case with a glass cover. Within the case were several odd sticks that were bent in the middle and had jewels inset in them among metal bits. There were also matching bracelets with each one. Machwa's eyes widened as he looked over them. "Saruth, what are they? They look like weapons from the sharp metal edges, but I don't think I've seen one before." Saruth mimed tossing something and catching it, and pointed to a detailed, wall-wide painting of men in battle above the displays. Machwa looked at the painting, taking in the scene of men on a large raft, one of them pushing it with a long pole, while several others were in the act of throwing or catching the weapons. There were what Machwa could only imagine were fazoogas falling from the trees around them, stricken by their empowered wrath at range. "Whoa!" They are a variation on the Regentan throwing stick. These are flybacks, and they return even if you hit your target. They are an invention of my people, Machwa. Long ago, when we first discovered the Regentan Tortanga sages, the people of my homeland knew that they had employed some of the same skills we do. They are singers, of a sort, Machwa. They had their throwing stick, which was effective, but not as much as it could have been. We improved it and then showed select Tortanga sages how to do so as well. Without bogging you down in too much detail, I'll say that the bracelets draw the weapon back to the user and allow the will of the user to be imparted to them. It's impressive how well these noble people use such a tool. I'm sure you'll see it at least once before we leave the country. Machwa's face showed awe as he looked past the glass, sniffing as though he could smell the weapons through the scents of preserved goods and dust. He glanced up. "Why did you help them? Why did you need to?" Saruth clucked his tongue. It was the right thing to do. At the time there were more Fazugas than ever before or since, and the Wazellans were being overrun, besieged in their own city. Machwa licked his nose and looked back into the case. "I wish I could throw one." Saruth grinned at him. "Maybe someday you'll have one. Let's go have a look at the animals now." Saruth read plaques about so many kinds of bugs that Machwa couldn't keep track of them except to know which few were the ones that could kill a person with a sting or a bite. There was one beetle that was very large and had elements in its rear that created light. Another bug was long and spindly, with an abundance of legs, and was used to clean wounds. Its saliva was a natural painkiller and antiseptic, and it was placed in sores to allow the painless cleaning of infections. Saruth put a finger to his chin. "I should see about acquiring some of these to take home for such use." Machwa almost gagged. "Yuck! I'd never want one of those bugs in me, even if I had a nasty sore." Saruth gave him a look of amusement. "If you had an infection, I'd hope you would. It says here that the creature doesn't like healthy tissue, and will leave the host after the infection is gone in search of a new one or a corpse." Machwa made another face and moved down the aisle to point to a tapestry of a flying beetle. "What's that?" "That's a flittiu. It makes flowers grow fruit. They're native to Barumath, too. I'm surprised you don't know them on sight, but then they don't like cities." Machwa rolled his eyes. "It's a bug. I never cared before what kind of bug a bug is." Saruth offered a nod and pointed behind Machwa. "I'm sure you can guess what that is." Machwa lifted a brow and turned. He yipped when he stood face to face with a large Fazuga. Saruth reached out and bonked it on its head with his staff, and the stuffed creature made a dull thump. Machwa looked up at Saruth, who grinned down at him. "Thou art saved. I have vanquished the mighty Fazuga to protect you." Machwa rolled his eyes and then looked back to inspect the large teeth the creature had. He gulped and tried not to sound scared. "I'll bet these are as bad as that guy said they were. It really looks mean, Saruth." "Indeed. I'd loathe to encounter a large number in their native environment. They are formidable." Machwa gave a shiver and turned to look at the next display. After a while of roaming the place and returning to Machwa's favorite displays, Saruth looked up through a skylight and said, "Machwa, our time here will shortly draw to an end, because there's some other business I must take care of." Machwa's belly rumbled. "Okay, let's go."